Thank you to the Archdiocese for inviting me to speak at this speaking series. It's a great honour to be speaking in the name of Laurel Blow, and it was a pleasure to meet you, Judy, Auntie Judy. I want to acknowledge country as well, acknowledge the traditional owners and their elders past and present, but also I want to, and listening to the introductions, I want to acknowledge all of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are part of the Archdiocese for, the work that you have done to educate and inform over the years, and to help people to come along with us on this journey. I said I'm an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander man, so my mob are the Kurrareg people, which is the islands closest to the mainland in the Torres Strait. Kukugal, which is the Central Island group, and Erabumle, an island up near Mer, or Murray Island, in the northeast of the Torres Strait. But I'm born and bred on Larrakia country, and so that's where my journey starts. And what I'll do in this speech is I'm going to share with you how I came to be involved in this, why I believe in it so passionately, so I'm going to go into some detail about that. It'll be the context from my point of view on why this is important, and I hope that you'll be able to relate to it. I'll talk about the longer history of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, so the long lead up to this moment. I'll also talk about the contemporary history of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, so how it was made, and what has happened since 26 May 2017 when it was endorsed with standing acclamation and tears of joy and hope. I'm going to talk about its proposals, why they're important, and I think, and I decided last minute, and annoyed everybody with wanting to put a PowerPoint up, but I want to go into the details of this. What is it exactly that we are voting on later this year? How is it structured? And I'm a Wharfie, so I don't think I'll bore you too much with a bit of legal talk, because it'll be legal talk from a Wharfie's point of view. But I hope to help you to understand, exactly how this is going to benefit our people and what it is not. Okay? So, some context for today. I am a Wharfie. I began on the wharves in Darwin when I was 17 years old. I was a quiet fella, you wouldn't get me, never ever thought I'd be standing up in front of a group like this. People thought I had no voice at all. I was so quiet, whether it was at the workplace or at footy. I played rugby league until I was 31. But as a Wharfie, I got a real understanding of standing up for your rights. It's where I learnt the value of unity, and how unity is something that is more than what you just say at a rally, or in a coming together like this, a forum. But it actually requires structure. It requires an understanding of who your leaders are, representatives. It requires an opportunity to hold your leaders or your representatives to account, to ensure that they are speaking on your behalf. It also really needs the ability for a people to come together regularly, to have debate and discussion, to work out how you can move forward together in unity. Unless you have those opportunities, you tend to be a bit of a rabble, right? And you're not effective. Because unity really is somewhat, it's a means to achieve things when people come together. And this isn't, I was a member of the Maritime Union of Australia, and I'm still an official of the MUA. But this isn't something that's unique to workers and unions, right? It's similar for business council, for example, industry associations, or even religious groups. It is just how you do things together. Now, I was on the wharf when the 1998 Patrick's dispute happened. Some of you might remember the Patrick's dispute. I was there on the wharves. And for those that don't know about it, it was John Howard was the Prime Minister at the time. And John Howard colluded with Patrick Stevedores, one of the two major stevedoring companies or wharfie companies in the country, to try and break our union, so to try and silence the voice of maritime workers. And I was wondering, I'll talk about what I saw in the process leading up to that, but we were able to get over that. We were able to defeat that attack. Just to explain a bit more about what happened, in the middle of the night in April 1998, mercenaries basically moved onto the wharves through the gates and, you know, those rubber Zodiac dinghies, and they climbed up the wharves, and it was like a military type insurrection. And they physically dragged us from our livelihoods and locked us out. And we were able to fight back because we had the resources to do so. We took it to the courts, it ended up in the High Court. We also had solidarity from the community. Some of you might have been down the docks in Brisbane here as part of that. Yep, we've got one person at least. Thank you for your solidarity. I kept a good job because of that, you know. We managed to get our jobs back. And we also had a lot of support from the community, because one of the things, and I'm telling you this, not because I want you all to join a union, though that'd be good. I'm telling you all of this because it comes back to how I understand the importance of a voice. But it's the reason why I was so proud to be a wharfie. So, I mean, I wasn't indoctrinated into the union movement or anything. My parents weren't activists. You know, they weren't even staunch unionists. But I saw how the union had all of this support when our backs were up against the wall. And I learnt that it was because we used the power of our unity not just for our own wages and conditions, but we had used it for social justice for a very long time. And one of the things that I was particularly interested in was how the MUA, the union, had supported my own people's struggle for a very long time. I'll just give several examples. In the 1920s, they say the first all-Aboriginal political organisation was the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association. And the leader of that was a Warramai man named Fred Maynard, and he was a wharfie, and undoubtedly had the support of his fellow workers and his union. In 1946, there was a Pilbara strike, and it was Aboriginal stock workers or pastoral station workers in the Pilbara that walked off in protest for equal wages. And I learnt that seafarers and wharfies in those days refused to export the cargoes from those pastoral stations in solidarity with those workers and help them to get a better and fairer wages. In 1966, there was the Gurindji Wave Hill Walk-Off. The Gurindji Wave Hill Walk-Off, similar to the Pilbara strike, was 200 Aboriginal stock workers, domestics and their families. They walked off Wave Hill Station, a station near Katherine in the Northern Territory, in protest for equal wages, which became a long struggle for land rights. And so the Gurindji people, like other Aboriginal people across this country, they were only paid in rations. So some beef bones, some flour, some tobacco, a bit of sugar. They were working around 16-hour days. They had no time for recreation or to bury their dead with dignity. Now, I just pose this question to you. Do you think that's working for rations if you are only getting enough sustenance to work those incredible hours each day, or do you think that's slavery? If you're only getting enough sustenance to work every day and you have no time for anything else, I think that's more like slavery. So the Gurindji people, you'd know the song, From Little Things Big Things Grow, Kevin Carmody and Paul Kelly. It's a story that all Australians should know. And so after around 9 years of struggle, After Gough Whitlam became the Prime Minister, that big, tall, white man, the leader of this nation, travelled to Gurindji country. And there's that iconic photo of Gough Whitlam and Vincent Lingiari, the leader of the Gurindji people, receiving a handful of sand, symbolic of winning some land back. Now, the Gurindji people are great supporters of this campaign for a constitutionally enshrined voice. As a wharfie and a union official, I travelled regularly to Gurindji country to celebrate the anniversary of the walk-off for many years now. They're great supporters of this campaign because while the moment of receiving that handful of sand is something that we should celebrate, and we should all understand for the courage of those people and the allyship that we receive from non-Indigenous people from around the country, that wonderful moment, what happened after the handful of sand is important. The Gurindji people established a cattle company and a mining company, Muramala, and they suffered from paternalism. They suffered from sabotage, particularly from the Country Liberal Party that was in power in the Northern Territory at the time, whose members of Parliament had organised Rights for Whites rallies in Katherine, the nearby town. The Gurindji dream was to live on their land their way. But what they learnt when the handful of sand had been received is that it's one thing to have your land, but it's another thing to be able to influence the policies and the laws that control how you are able to enjoy your land in the way that you wish to. So the Gurindji people are big supporters of a voice, because that's logically and from experience the next step. I became an official of the union in 2010. I had to find my voice after the 98 Patrick's dispute because all of the good old staunch old wharfies, you know, they retired. Actually, it was part of the arrangement. You know, there was a whole lot of redundancies. And to protect what our union elders had fought for, I felt I had to step up and speak up. So that's how I started to become a spokesperson and an organiser. As an official, I continued the tradition of our union. I helped our own people in our struggles, the injustices. And I'll give some examples. In 2015, some of you might remember the community closures issue. There was protests all around the country. And what had happened was that Tony Abbott was the Prime Minister at the time, and he cut hundreds of millions of dollars from services in our remote communities. And I'll just digress to mention this. In the media recently, you would have heard about the violence and the crime rates in Alice Springs and towns like Darwin, where I'm from. I want you to think about why you see an increase of these social issues. If you look back to when these children were not quite born yet or babies, these services were vital into fetal alcohol syndrome, you know, support for healing, you know, for legal services, medical services. This removal of that funding has a ripple, you know, it ripples on to what you see today. It's like a slowly growing, you know, snowballs. There are repercussions for these harmful decisions. And so I organised the rallies and things around that. Another example is, do you remember that Four Corners show that time when it exposed what was happening in the youth detention centre in Darwin, Dondale? I remember watching that with my wife, and we were both in tears, just seeing just seeing exactly what was happening in that place. Children as young as 10 years old, who sure had done things against the law and were in there for those reasons. But do you think treating children like that, and especially if you understand the science, is going to get those children back onto the straight and narrow to contribute to society? Or do you think it perpetuates those issues? Do you think that does anything for the victims of crime? or does it continue it? We know that tough on crime doesn't work, and that sort of treatment of children leads to damage that lasts the rest of their life. I noticed though in those times that for all of our protest, you know, and coming from a union and rah and all that, but I started to notice that this pattern of activism that, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that those sorts of actions aren't important, but what I noticed is that we're far too ineffective, that the decision makers were feeling no repercussions for the harmful or neglectful decisions they were making, that we could get good numbers on the street, or, you know, and not just on the street, but the swell of support from around the country to say this isn't good enough when the injustice is fresh. But always, if you organise in this space, there are diminishing numbers. It's hard to keep people turning out. People go back to their lives. But also, one of the tools that is used, and it's not always with ill intent to take away momentum, but it does take away momentum, is that the inquiries that we demand, you know, happen. At best, we would get a royal commission into youth in detention, or deaths in custody, or stolen generations. But often what happens is the report takes months or years, the momentum is gone from the people's movement, and then the report comes out, and the recommendations, many of them, are dismissed and ignored. Or recommendations that are implemented are not done genuinely with the people most affected and they fail. Okay? So this is something that we really need to think about. Well, I certainly was thinking about it at the time. The other thing is that we could have 5 speakers on the stump at a rally and 10 different solutions to one problem. This incoherency was part of the ineffectiveness of our advocacy. And then I noticed the way that we were deciding what we should be saying to people was fought in disjointed rallies, disjointed meetings, or over social media. And you see the lateral violence that comes with that, right? Because it's not a proper way to debate and discuss things. So I was looking for something that we could do better, and fortunately others were too. And I was invited to a constitutional convention, a constitutional dialogue in Darwin. And so it was there that I learnt, I wasn't part of the constitutional recognition debate or movement at the time, but I started to learn about it. And what I learnt was that this dialogue came from struggle in itself. In 2015, there's a statement called the Kirribilli Statement. Not a lot of you have heard of it, I suppose, but the Kirribilli Statement was when 39 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people called for a meeting with the Prime Minister and the opposition leader because there was a crisis. The gap was widening. And the Kirribilli Statement said 2 things that are very important to this. Firstly, it said when it comes to constitutional recognition, we seek a form of recognition that is not merely symbolic, but a form of recognition that empowers us to gain greater fairness for our people. Secondly, the Kirribilli Statement said that we understand how meetings happen and then nothing comes from it. So we would like a referendum council to be established to take the question of what form of constitutional recognition our people could accept. So take that question to our communities and to the broader Australian public about what form of constitutional recognition would be acceptable. And so that's where this dialogue came from. At the dialogues, we got an understanding of the Constitution, how in 1901 the Constitution had the race power, Section 5126, the people of any race other than the Aboriginal race in any state for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. So the Parliament could make special laws about a race of people. That is still in there. But those words in red were removed in the 67 referendum so that the federal government could have the power to make laws about Indigenous people. That didn't mean that laws couldn't be made about Indigenous people. It meant that it rested that power rested in the states. And the states were, to our people, cruel and negligent. And so the elders of those times thought that this would be better for us, that the federal government should have that power. They were seen as more benevolent, but also for consistency across the country, so that when there's an advance, the federal government could take those advances forward as a federal nation. The other change in '67 that is important here is that the Constitution discriminated against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to not count us as Australian citizens in the census. And so when we say that we were counted in 1967, that was how we were counted. Okay? It wasn't a right to vote that we gained in '67, that was happening in various states at different times. But these were the main changes to that. So we got an intense lesson on civics. It was 100 participants at all of the dialogues, not to exclude anybody. And I want to acknowledge Professor Megan Davis, a Cobble woman, expert in public law, lead designer of the process. But it wasn't to exclude anyone to have 100 participants, it was to apply a formula to ensure a cross-section of perspectives and experiences from our people, so that it wasn't just, and by then I was pretty loud, it wasn't just the loudest of us that could skew the results of each dialogue, but to ensure the quieter of our advocates, our healers, our frontline service workers, to ensure that they could be heard too. The dialogues were 3 days each, and we considered these lessons from the past. Rachel Perkins, world-class filmmaker, daughter of Charlie Perkins, put together a film that covered the history of our struggle. And I'll just mention these other statements and petitions, just some, not all of them, there's many. Aspirational moments where our people have come together, reached a consensus, put it in writing, put it to the powers that be, and always with modest proposals that should have been accepted. But I'll talk about a pattern here. There's the petition to the King here in the 30s. William Cooper was one of the great leaders of those times. The 1963 Yirrkala Bark petitions, the Yolngu people seeking to protect country. The 1972 Larrakia petition to the Queen. All of these statements and petitions have in common that they were dismissed and ignored by the King or the Queen or the Parliament that they were written to. All of these statements and petitions called for political representation, a voice. And so this isn't something new here that we're talking about. First Nations people have been calling for a voice for a very long time. The 1988 Barunga Statement, a little different, because Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister at the time. You can see Yunupingu there, one of the great Aboriginal leaders of our time. Bob Hawke travelled to Barunga, a little community, Aboriginal community near Katherine in the Northern Territory. The anniversary is very soon of the Barunga Statement. And he listened to the Indigenous leaders, and he promised two things from the Barunga Statement. He promised a national treaty, and he wasn't able to deliver on that. The WA government in particular fought against it on behalf of the minerals industry. But he did also promise and deliver on a voice, and the words in the Barunga Statement are, "We call on the Commonwealth Parliament to pass laws providing a national elected Aboriginal and Islander organisation to oversee Aboriginal and Islander affairs." And so Hawke went about delivering on that. He guided through Parliament the legislation that set up ATSIC, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. Now, the opposition leader of that time was John Howard. And John Howard vehemently opposed the establishment of this voice. And as soon as he won power and became Prime Minister, he went about destroying it. What he did was he amplified the issues that ATSIC was having. And all organisations have issues from time to time, but he didn't celebrate the good things that ATSIC was doing. No, just amplified the problems. The first thing that he did was he defunded ATSIC, and so there was a tactic of divide and conquer. Our people started to fight over what was left. It was a service providing, it had funding, ATSIC, to deliver services. And this was a strategy that I saw myself, not just as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person, but as a member of the MUA. I was 20-year-old on the wharf. I was wondering, you know, young, naive, why is the media always got us, you know, in the news as lazy or saying that our officials were corrupt? You know, all of these sorts of things that I knew weren't true because I was on the wharf. And if they were true, then the law should have dealt with it, right? But he was softening up the Australian public before he moved the mercenaries in to drag us from our livelihoods. He did the same thing with ATSIC. Tried and tested, softened up the Australian public. He got the support of the Latham Labor opposition and then repealed or silenced that voice with a simple majority in Parliament. Now there's a pattern in that too. Our voices. We haven't always waited for a government to do things for us. I mentioned the AAPA. That was silenced by pure intimidation. The Protection Board, you know, the powers that be, and I acknowledge, you know, the elders in this room have lived through this. They had the power to steal our children legally. They had the power to exile us from country, to separate us from our families, to direct us to work without pay, to hold our wages, what wages we got, and not give them to us. They used those powers to intimidate the leaders of these early voices until they were silenced, disappeared from the public eye in around 1927. John Maynard is the grandson of Fred Maynard. He's written a brilliant book, for those of you that are taking notes, called A Fight for Liberty and Freedom. And it talks about those times and what happened. But, you know, I'm not going to go through them all. We established representation many times throughout history, and each time they've been silenced by intimidation, by funding cuts, by being ignored, or changes of policy where benevolent governments have been convinced to establish representation, or by repealing the legislation with a majority in Parliament. So we know from this pattern that we need to establish a voice, the things that I was protesting about, that you guys have no doubt joined us in trying to support us with. We know that we need to have an effective voice to stop things like the Northern Territory intervention, you know, to stop funding cuts that lead to the problems that we see in our communities today, to see better policy, and to see the justice system improve, to understand the traumas that we live with. Now, here's a cartoon from the book. Kathy Wilcox, she's a great political cartoonist. It's in the book that Kerry O'Brien and I have written and published recently, the Voice to Parliament Handbook. All the details you need. We actually do know that eventually the government is going to come along and be that. Okay? We're only 3% of the population. We need to do better. We need to learn from the lessons from the past. So these are the things that we considered in these dialogues. Two things these dialogues did at the end of the 3 days. They had a record of meeting put up before anybody left, and it was endorsed after any amendments that were needed. And then we elected representatives to go to the heart of the country, to Uluru, to have a final culminating national constitutional convention. You can see us there doing the work. We were 270 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from all around the place, all our different perspectives and experiences, and 3 days there. And our role was to bring together those accurate records of meetings, to synthesise them and try and bring it together in one collective statement. And that's the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And so here you can see, soon after the moment that we endorsed it with standing acclamation, a joyous moment, a political feat, I want you to understand, a political feat that should be celebrated in this country forever. 270 of us, there's 250 standing there. On the second day, 20 of our people walked out in protest, straight into a media scrum, told some porcupines about what happened in there. I tell you this because it's normal. We're not homogenous. Factions form. People have entrenched positions. They try and leverage their position. Normal. But we stayed, the rest of us, and did the hard work. We're a bit low on morale after they walked out, you know, because we hoped that we would stay together. But we did the hard work and we reached an agreement. And there it is. The Uluru Statement from the Heart. It's a canvas 1.6 by 1.8 metres. I'll recite it now, and I hope that you feel what we felt in the room on that morning. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom remain attached thereto and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished, and it coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That a peoples possessed the land for 60 millennia and this sacred link should disappear from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionately, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alien from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish, they will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. It's Uluru Statement. So you can see here the Uluru lawwoman that painted the Uluru Statement. Soon after the endorsement that same morning, Rachel marked out these pencil marks here that you can still see. We put our names and our mob all around. Then those women painted around this part here on the outer edge. And then finally Rachel organised for the statement itself to be printed in the middle. And I was entrusted to take that canvas around the country, not because I was anything special really, but because I had some funding. The union in our tradition. So Malcolm Turnbull almost immediately dismissed the Uluru Statement from the heart. Arnie Pat Anderson and Professor Megan Davis had visited my union and said, Thomas has got some decent things to say, can he help us out? So I was seconded to the movement, you know, my salary, my travel, accommodation, not employed by anybody in particular, but just to use my initiative. And I said, well, I think that this statement is powerful. When I first held it and saw it in Garma in late August, in early August 2017. And so I was entrusted with it to take it to the people. This here is the Yule River Bush meeting in the Pilbara, a place where the tribes of the Pilbara have been meeting for many thousands of years, and they still come together there now annually. I'm going there in July, going full circle. It's going to be special. It's in Cairns, Yule River again, just all over the place, just travelling with the statement for 2 years before I gave it to Professor Megan Davis to look after. I was getting a bit tattered after rolling it out on office floors and on the dirt, you know, and in the grass. But it had done its job and started some momentum, and I've continued to do it with the support of the union for 6 years now. So now let's get stuck into it, eh? All of that leads to this. Okay, the key proposal in the Uluru Statement is for a constitutionally enshrined voice. Constitutionally enshrined because we must learn from the lessons from the past. We need a voice. We know that it's important in a democracy. I think that's a no-brainer, right? People need to be heard in a proper way, not just through someone that the politicians select to speak for us, but through people that we can choose and hold to account and inform. And so the only way to do that is in this political system, in our way that government works, is to enshrine it in the Constitution. The Constitution is simply a rule book for the nation. It's the rule book that even the politicians must follow. Remember Section 44 and all the politicians losing their job? That's how powerful it is. It's only the Australian people that can change it. That's why the Uluru Statement is addressed to you. Now, it's compulsory voting in a referendum, okay? For those that are unaware, we don't have many, so people need to catch up. It's a double majority required for it to pass. A majority of Australians overall, but you also need to have a majority of voters in a majority of states, 4 out of 6. The territories don't count for that measure, they only count towards that measure, okay? And the most successful was in 1967 with 91.8% voting to remove those racist provisions. Well, didn't remove the racist provisions, but it removed part of it. One of the things that are being said, and I'll just digress here, is that 1967 removed race, right? And this today is about putting race back, and they're saying, you know, Dutton said this is re-racialising. Remember I said Section 5126 is still there. I want you to know a couple of things about that race power. It's only been used to make special laws about Indigenous people. No other group, fortunately for other groups. But in the 90s, there was the Hindmarsh case in the High Court, and it found that that power could be used to discriminate to the detriment of Indigenous people, not necessarily for our benefit. And so one of the things that was considered in the dialogues was removing the race power or amending it to make it power to make laws about Indigenous people for our benefit. 2 things about that. If we removed the race power, it would put in jeopardy some beneficial laws, such as the Native Title Act or land rights. If we amended it it's still a legal mechanism that's sort of after the decision has been made, right? So, for example, a decision that we as Indigenous people thought was not beneficial, that would go to the High Court. The government would argue it's beneficial for women and children, like they might have with the intervention, which we know was wrong and has failed for great expense. And they might win that High Court case. So the people leant towards a voice to monitor the use of the race power, to influence the decisions that are made about us. Okay? So a political power that can do things proactively, develop policy and put it to a government, rather than reactively. I hope that's understandable. The process. I'm part of the referendum working group with Aunty Jackie Huggins and Professor Marcia Langton, Peter Yu, 20 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that have been deeply involved in this for some time. We negotiated the words that will go into the Constitution and the question, and also some design principles. We've done that. There's been a 6-week committee process, Joint Select Committee, and right now we're here. The Parliament is debating the referendum alteration bill. It passed the lower house yesterday, I think it was. When that passes, the government calls the referendum no sooner than 2 months after the bill passes and no later than 6 months. I think it'll be mid-October. Nobody wants to vote in September because of footy finals. It'll be a protest vote. So I think it'll be mid-October because November and December are getting a bit late for the wet season, you know, further north. The question, I hope I'm not going too long, just give us a yell if I am, Joni, please. I'm almost finished. A question is, this is the question. This will pass, okay? We're pretty confident we've got the numbers in the Senate. A proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? Yes. Simple, right? And this is why I say you can see the detail here. This is all the detail, all right? We're not talking about how many representatives and all that. That's not what we're voting on. Because if we talked about that now, if we said it's 24 representatives and they're from these places, we'd start fighting over that. Someone would say, I think it should be 25, and someone would say, I think it's 30. You know, and on you'd go. A bit of a attempt to draw that out of us by the coalition, but we knew that they were just going to then continue to attack any little bit of detail that we gave them. We knew that they were shaping up to oppose it just by the way they were behaving. So this is all the detail. What it does is, well, before that, firstly, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia, recognising our existence, our continuing connection to this place, that we are the first peoples as we acknowledge country and everything everywhere these days. That shouldn't be unusual. 1, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. So it establishes that the Parliament is to set up an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, and they cannot take it away. 2, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So it gives the voice the ability to make representations to the Parliament and Executive Government. This has been a point of contention, but let me explain why we stood our ground as Indigenous leaders on this. By the time things reach the Parliament, the deal's already done. The policy has been shaped, okay? The Executive Government is the government, the ministers, the heads of department. We need to be at the inception of these policies that affect us. We need to be shaping them from the beginning, down on the ground level. Otherwise, we're not going to get the results that our people need. Now, does this cause the wheels of government to grind to a halt? No. The most eminent constitutional experts in the nation have said no. Okay? There is no third chamber here. There is no right to veto. There is no requirement that the Parliament must take advice before they make a decision. No, the words are clear here. For anyone that has even a little bit of a legal document reading understanding or a wharfie reading, no, it doesn't. One of the most respected silks in the country, and that often takes constitutional matters to the High Court, Brett Walker, described that sort of stuff as fantastical doomsaying. You know, it's just, it's not going to cause the wheels of government to grind to a halt. And matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, that's a point of contention as well that you might hear about. Senator Cash in the West has said, Indigenous people are going to start wanting to tell us what happens with parking tickets and where to park our submarines. You know, they're going to tell us where we've got to park our submarines. I mean, I'm not going to swear like a wharfie, but you know, it's rubbish. But we also stood our ground on this. It needs to be pretty open because things like superannuation, we might have a say about those policies, partly because of our life expectancy, right, is around 10 years less. It's just it's not so cut and dry about what is an Indigenous matter. But let me put it to you like this. As if we're going to waste our time with matters that our people don't care about. Remember, this is a democratic elected representative body. Would lose all credibility, you wouldn't be elected again. I mean, it's like you know, the Archdiocese going to see Albo tomorrow and saying, hey, Albo, we want to talk about maritime laws, you know. You know, we're not interested. You'd lose credibility and, you know, your people would be disappointed in you because you're not talking about things that matter to you. And again, it's only advice to the Parliament. And then this last part, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including composition, functions, powers and procedures. They decide the rest. So the point here is that subject to the Constitution. So it guarantees us a voice. Representations is important, so it doesn't mean that this ensures that they can't just say, okay, Joni, you're the voice for Indigenous people from now on, you know. They can't do that. Representations is broader, okay. It needs to be a way of hearing from Indigenous people on the ground in our communities. So that's protection there. Okay, design principles. When we announced those words, if you remember back in April, I was standing behind the Prime Minister. I looked like a bouncer in the photos. We had done this work as well and announced it. So these design principles, we understood that there is a hunger for more detail than what I just said. And so, you know, we provided these things to help address the things that people are interested in. What is the detail that people want to know? So things like, especially for our mob, the voice will be representative of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, gender balanced and include youth, okay? The voice will be chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people based on the wishes of local communities. So part of this, it's not up here on this, there's more than this, is that immediately after the referendum succeeds, there'll be a process of going back to communities and finding out, you know, developing the model, okay? The voice will be accountable and transparent. The voice will give independent advice to the Parliament and government, and on it goes. It won't have a program delivery function like ATSIC did. We have Aboriginal controlled organisations now that do such things, so it won't manage money, and it won't have a veto power. These were in the reading of the bill, the introduction of the bill, so they hold some legal weight as well about what the model will be. All right, I won't go through all of these because I've probably used up my time, but looking ahead, I know that you guys have, you know, the Archdiocese have solidly supported this, and I hope that continues with initiatives to help people understand why they should vote yes. Okay, within the political bounds that you need to operate in, I don't know about those too much, but as strong as you possibly can. We cannot fail at this, okay? We need to do something different. There is a real problem that requires this sort of initiative, change, systemic change, and we know it's the key to closing the gap, okay? And so achieving it is practical, because common issues in our communities like housing, the justice system, infrastructure, quality of programs, all of those things are will be affected by us having a voice in a positive way. It's the key to closing the gap. But also it's about who we are as a nation, our identity, our standing in the world, the fact that, as Linda Burney said, and it was fact-checked during the election campaign, Australia is not only the only like nation that doesn't have a treaty with Indigenous peoples, it's also the only like nation that doesn't have constitutional recognition of Indigenous peoples. We're just catching up here, okay? We're not jumping ahead even. Now, if we should fail, it's an official dismissal of that invitation. It's an official continuing the ignorance to our very existence. And it's officially saying no to giving fairness to a people that we make decisions about all the time. 97% of Australians decide who is elected. We're only around 3% of the population. So, you know, our elected members, they need this voice to make better decisions as well. We cannot fail. So Yes23 is the website there, and there's a kitchen tables campaign. Perhaps you guys can really sink your teeth into this one. Togetheryes.com.au. It's about, talking to the people that you can influence. The media has been terrible. Positive stories have had a negative headline. The way we get through that is genuine grassroots organising, okay? Talking to the people that you know, that trust you and that love you. Please use the book. It's not for profit, the Voice to Parliament handbook. 50% of the royalties go to Indigenous Literacy Foundation. Kerry and I won't get our, our costs back on it, because it's only going to be useful till October, so buy lots of copies. Give it to people that are uncertain. I'm hearing, that people are changing their minds when they read it, because it's what I just delivered to you in a nutshell. Thank you. I'll stand here for Q&A. Thank you. Okay.